the Hudson Library and Historical Society's Adult Program Series presents a special program about one of America's great garden experts of all time. America's third president and author of the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson. Presented by Mr. Peter J. Hatch, former Director of Gardens and Grounds at Jefferson's home, Monticello. Author of 3 books about the historic Monticello grounds and gardens. Recorded at the Hudson Library's Flood Meeting Room on August 26, 2015.
Welcome to the Hudson Library and Historical Society. We're delighted to host this evening Mr. Hatch, who is going to speak to you. But before we get to that, I have a couple commercials, so bear with me. First and foremost, it's wonderful to be in Hudson with such a wonderful, giving, and friendly community. And we are deeply indebted to the Hudson Garden Club, whose partnership on this program made this possible. Please patronize their garden tour in June and their other events as well. Secondly, as you all know, everything costs money, unfortunately. And the library can always use extra money to host wonderful programming like this. So if you would like to make a donation, and I'm not saying you have to, but there is a little box in the back of the room where you can drop an extra $1 or whatever change you have in your pocket, and we will use that money toward more programming, hopefully fantastic programming. If you have suggestions for programming, please grab us or grab me and tell me so that we can sort of try and make those work. I want to say hello to Hudson Cable. They are also filming and they have their own microphone. So Larry, are we getting a little better? Okay. Without further ado, I'm going to put this microphone there and hopefully it'll be better. But I want to introduce you to a wonderful gentleman who actually grew up in suburban Detroit. I find it very interesting that this phenomenal gardener grew up in the city. Peter Hatch was the former head gardener at Monticello, and he spent years of his life reading Thomas Jefferson's journals about gardening, and he hopefully recreated them all, the gardens, that is, of Thomas Jefferson's. And so he's going to speak to us about our third president, Thomas Jefferson, and his gardens. And I would clearly say he is one of our national gardening experts, at least as it relates to Thomas Jefferson. And if you know how to get rid of a certain beetle, he might even be able to help you with that. He tells me he spends a great deal of time outdoors even today after he's retired in his own gardens. So without further ado, I want you to welcome, please, Mr. Peter Hatch.
I'm really honored, and it's really gratifying to speak at a public library. And this is quite an impressive place, a bustling hive of learning. And the future of this country is the way that libraries can be the core and the heart of a community. I think we have a lot to look forward to. And I know a little bit about Hudson because 50 years ago, as a schoolboy, I used to come here and play soccer and tennis against the academy. Western Reserve was part of our league that consisted of schools in New York and Pennsylvania and Michigan, as well as here in Ohio. And I have these really idyllic memories of coming here on the middle of October, and the trees in their full glory. And although it was 49 years ago, it's really a vivid memory. And so I knew Hudson, and I leaped at the opportunity to come here and speak to you this evening. And as well, I have a friend in Charlottesville who grew up in Hudson, and we watch soccer games together. Her children are the same age as my children. We talk about Ian Fraser, Sandy Fraser, who she grew up with. So I'm a stranger, but I'm no Hudsonian, but I know a little about this part of the world, and I'm pleased to be here. And I'm going to really talk about Thomas Jefferson's vegetable garden this evening. It's a story, I think, with a lot of universal themes. I don't think I need to introduce Thomas Jefferson too much. He, of course, was the third president of the United States and is most well known as being the author of the Declaration of Independence and the third president of the United States. He's also known, I think, as America's essential Renaissance man. And there's a famous quip that was made by John Kennedy when he was hosting a dinner party for Nobel Prize laureates, in which he said, well, this is the greatest meeting of minds in the White House since Thomas Jefferson ate here all by himself. And what's unique about Monticello, Jefferson's lifelong home, is that like no other house, it's an autobiographical statement. You see all the different dimensions of Jefferson's interest and his genius. You see Jefferson as an architect and as a farmer, as a lover of the classics, as an archaeologist. You see him as a man who knew 6 languages and played the fiddle. And you see the multitude of passions he had in the world. And particularly you see Jefferson as a gardener. And during my 35 years at Monticello, I found that there are few topics that tell us more about Thomas Jefferson than gardening. And my goal always was to show how there are few topics that tell us more about Thomas Jefferson than gardening itself. And he had a myriad of interest in the horticultural field as well, in botany and landscape design. When people would come to Monticello, they were given tours of what Mr. Jefferson referred to as his pet trees. His overseer, a man named Edmund Bacon, recalled that the flowers at Monticello bloomed virtually every month of the year. Jefferson was a keen and avid botanist and would go on botanical rambles as far away as upstate New York, and he had this species of wildflower named in his honor, the Jeffersonia diphylla. And it was named for Jefferson by a very prominent early American botanist named Benjamin Smith Barton, who said that it was Jefferson's knowledge of natural history that was rivaled by that of few people in the United States, particularly of botany and zoology. And the common name of this plant is twinleaf, and it doesn't grow anywhere better than it does in southeastern Ohio. It's called twinleaf for that sort of bisected leaf. Jefferson documented the planting of 170 varieties of the finest fancy fruit that was known in the United States in the early 1800s. And his legacy as a lover of fine wine and as a grape grower is constantly recalled today by this burgeoning Virginia wine industry. We now have some 200 wineries within an hour-and-a-half drive of Charlottesville, where Monticello exists still today. And Jefferson said amazing things like, no nation is drunken when wine is cheap, and wine is indispensable to my health. So he's an easy peg for this rising industry to hang its hat on in promoting its efforts today to revitalize Virginia viticulture. But it's really Jefferson's vegetable garden that was his chief horticultural achievement of his tenure at Monticello. When Jefferson used the word garden, he was really reserving the term exclusively for this 1,000-foot-long terrace that was literally hewed out of the south side of his little mountain. This was really the garden of Jefferson's retirement era. Between the ages of 67 and his death in 83, between 1809 when he retired from the presidency until his death in 1826, walking into this garden and sowing peas or writing down in his garden book when his salsify was harvested in October of 1814 was sort of his defiance of age. It was a barometer to his health to be able to actually garden itself. And even at the age of 81 years old in 1824, Jefferson read about giant cucumbers that were grown in Cleveland, Ohio, in a Cleveland, Ohio newspaper. So he wrote to Thomas Worthington, who was the governor of Ohio at the time, and he asked him for seeds of these giant cucumbers. He got the seed, he passed it around to his friends, he sowed them in his garden, he measured in Jeffersonian form how long each one was. And Jefferson once wrote about his own personal gardening that, although an old man, he wrote, I am but a young gardener. And here he was very much at the age of 81, being an old man, but very much a wide-eyed, youthful, innocent, appreciative, adventuresome gardener. These may have been something like the 7-foot-long cucumbers they read about in the Cleveland newspaper. Jefferson, of course, was a lifelong slaveholder. He described slavery as an abominable crime, and he also described his role as a slaveholder as being like holding the wolf by the ears, that he felt that, in his opinion, holding on to the institution was necessary for his own self-preservation. And certainly enslaved African Americans did a lion's share of the labor in the gardens at Monticello, but there were a lot of interesting exceptions. Jefferson's daughters and granddaughters worked in the vegetable and flower gardens at Monticello. Jefferson, for short periods of time, had skilled European horticulturists who worked in the vineyards and the orchards at Monticello. And Jefferson himself worked in the gardens with his own hands. His participation in the gardening process was really rather remarkable. This is Isaac Jefferson. Isaac was a slave at Monticello who was freed after Jefferson died and went on to become a blacksmith in Petersburg, Virginia, when this photograph was taken of him just before the Civil War, and when he also left an oral history of life at Monticello as an enslaved person. And Isaac recalled that Jefferson himself would work in the cool evening in a right hard pace, in right good earnest, actually gardening with his own hands. Jefferson was a fairly handy guy. A friend of his, a woman named Margaret Bayard Smith, visited Monticello soon after Jefferson retired from the presidency, and she described how there was a portable seed rack that was carried from planting site to planting site, and on the seed rack were hundreds of glass vials and tin canisters of garden seed. And Jefferson would take the canisters and sow the seed with his own hands. Jefferson was an avid surveyor. On 5 different occasions during his retirement years, and you can't read this, but these are Jefferson's surveying notes as he relaid out the beds in this 1,000-foot-long garden. And Jefferson was out in February of 1810. He was old. He was probably a little arthritic, a little bent with age. His boots were probably covered with Albemarle County red clay. And he had with him a tool called a theodolite, which is like a transit that measures angles. And he also had with him a chain, which was like a tape measure. And one could see Jefferson out in the garden, his boots muddied by Albemarle County red clay, moving that theodolite from one angle to another 90-degree angle, and then telling Wormley Hughes, an enslaved head gardener at Monticello, to pull that chain tight and to drive a stake to mark an edge of one of these great beds. And then Jefferson recording it in his own meticulous fashion. Jefferson was really a fairly handy guy. Here he's regarded among the more cerebral of American historical figures, but even Isaac recalled that Jefferson was as good a hand as any man I've ever known in terms of making locks and keys with brass and iron in the Monticello blacksmith shop. So there's another interesting dimension to the myriad world of Jefferson's passions and interests was that he was handy. Jefferson was an avid record keeper. He kept numerous diaries of the weather and of his financial records and various plantation matters, but he also kept a garden diary called the Garden Book. And the Garden Book is 79 pages long and is bound in leather, and it resides today at the Massachusetts Historical Society. And you can go home after you hear me talk and Google Jefferson's Garden Book and actually read it online. And it's a diary of a scientist, observing and recording seemingly all the natural things that were going on around him. And this is a page from his garden book in 1812, in which he's organizing his entire 1,000-foot-long garden into 3 very specific categories according to which part of the plant was being harvested. Whether fruits like melons and nasturtiums and cucumbers, or roots like garlic and leeks, or leaves like spinach and sorrel and mustard. This is a time when Carl Linnaeus was organizing the whole animal and vegetable world into 2 simple terms, its genus and its species, really simplifying scientific classification like it had never been held before. And here's Jefferson doing something very similar in terms of organizing the whole vegetable world into these three very tidy categories according to which part of the plant was being harvested: fruits, roots, or leaves. Here's another page from his garden book. It's much more difficult to read, but it's his garden calendar from 1809. And on the left-hand column is a list of some 49 different vegetable varieties he was planting in the spring of 1809. In the middle column is a list of the fate of a lot of these plantings. And if you look closely, you can see the repetition of the word failed some 19 times. Failed, failed, killed by bug, failed nearly. In some ways, few gardeners failed as often as Thomas Jefferson. Few gardeners killed as many plants as Thomas Jefferson, but few gardeners had as much fun as Thomas Jefferson. He had almost what we call today a holistic view of the gardening process. He wrote that in gardening, it's the failure of one thing that is repaired by the success of another. A wonderful mantra, not just about gardening, but a lot of our other endeavors as well. He also wrote that if he failed 99 times out of 100 in his gardening experiments in Monticello, that one success was worth those 99 different failures. When the Hessian fly was destroying his wheat crop at Monticello, Jefferson seemed much more concerned about learning the life cycle of this destructive insect rather than the fact that his wheat crop, a cash crop, was on its way down the drain. One year, Jefferson got a letter from his daughter, Martha, and he was in Philadelphia serving as Secretary of State. And Martha, in this letter, complained about the insects that were ravaging her cabbage plants as fast as she could line them out or set them out in the vegetable garden. And so Jefferson wrote back to his daughter and said, well, the problem with the plants is they're growing in bad soil. And he said, this next winter, the two of us are going to cover the entire garden with a heavy coating of manure. He said, when plants are growing in rich soil, they will in turn, in Jefferson's words, they will bid defiance to all sorts of pests and droughts and diseases and weeds and insects and all the things that befall a gardener in a long, hot summertime in Virginia. So Jefferson was not only carrying the banner of the organic gardening movement, he didn't have too many alternatives at the time, but it shows how he believed in this sort of holistic relationship between wild nature on the one hand and the cultivated garden on the other. And during my tenure at Monticello, we'd get frustrated during a long, hot summer, and we'd end up using military images to describe the gardening process. We're out to blast these bugs or destroy these weeds. So it was always nice to fall back upon Jefferson's more balanced belief in that inevitable tension that exists between wild nature and the garden. Let's see here. Jefferson had fun gardening. It was an adventure for him. He designed an arbor along the entire 1,000-foot long length of the garden and planted it with different colors of flowering beans: purple, white, scarlet, and red. He planted the caracalla bean, which he said was the most delicious flowering bean in the world. He planted purple, white, and green sprouting broccolis in adjacent rows, and purple and white eggplants right next to each other. He reveled in odd-colored vegetables and many-headed cabbages and other kind of novelties of the vegetable world. And reading the garden book, one really gets a sense of one man's dance with the elements in terms of Jefferson's adventures in the vegetable gardening world. The garden, I think, is remarkable. It's very much an American garden in a lot of ways. It's a big garden, continental in some ways. This 1,000-foot-long vegetable garden terrace was literally hewed out of the side of the mountain by 7 slaves that Jefferson hired from a Fredericksburg, Virginia farmer. And over a period of 3 years before Jefferson left the presidency for retirement at Monticello, they moved some 400,000 cubic feet of earth with a mule and a cart to create this artificial plateau, hanging garden according to one person. It was actually overseen by Edmund Bacon, who was the overseer at the time, and as Jefferson was getting closer and closer to his retirement in March of 1809, he'd write weekly to Bacon to urge him on to get this terracing completed. And the terrace was supported by a 1,000-foot-long stone wall that some places is 12 or 15 feet high, and at the midway point of the garden, at the midway point of the wall, was this garden pavilion or garden temple that I'll talk about a little bit later. Then below the garden, below the terrace and below the garden wall was a 400-tree orchard that sort of formed a horseshoe shape around 2 vineyards and berry squares of currants and gooseberries, raspberries, and figs. So it was a big, big, big garden, some 8 acres in size. The garden, I think, was also remarkable in being an experimental laboratory for Jefferson. Jefferson once wrote that the greatest service which can be rendered any country is to add a useful plant to its culture. And this garden ultimately became a repository of some 330 varieties of 89 different species of vegetables. It was a veritable Ellis Island of new and unusual plants that were literally brought from the 4 corners of the globe. And Jefferson, in turn, was sort of a seedy missionary, as they get these unusual plants from France or from northern New York, from all over the world, and then he'd share them with his friends and neighbors and family, but also some of the major plantsmen of the early 1800s. The Texas bird pepper, seeds of which were sent to Jefferson by an American Army captain who was stationed in San Antonio, Texas. Jefferson was primarily a vegetarian, and he wrote that he ate meat only as a condiment to his meals. And this is sesame growing at the foot of the garden pavilion. And when he was serving as president, Jefferson had a blind tasting of salad oils. And people liked the sesame oil better than any other oil, olive oil or bean oil or any other kind of vegetable oil. So that set off this mad Jeffersonian obsession with growing sesame year in and year out. He sent seeds to his friends and said this is the most important plant that had ever been introduced in the United States. He devised 3 different presses in order to extract the oil from the seed itself. He failed and failed again, but persisted in growing sesame until his 82nd year. Very typical Jefferson obsession. Or the Chao de Milan cabbage that he sent home from Paris. It's a variegated Savoy cabbage that's very, very beautiful. Or the rutabaga in the upper right-hand corner. And it's really hard to prove that Jefferson was the first person to grow this or the first person to grow that, but a good case can be made that Jefferson was the first American to grow rutabagas. So here we have the 3rd President of the United States and the author of the Declaration of Independence. Here we have Thomas Jefferson, rutabaga man. The garden was important not just because it was big and it was American because of its experimental character, but also because of the kind of the continental panorama in which it existed. As you look over this garden toward the southeast, toward Richmond, Virginia, some 60 miles, you can almost feel like you can see forever. It's a view that was referred to as the sea view because it resembled a vision out into a foggy ocean. Or if one looked the other direction across the rows of vegetables to a mountain right next door to Monticello, it's called Montalto. It's 400 feet higher than Monticello. Montalto in Italian means high mountain as opposed to Monticello, which means little mountain. And it's a lovely view, and 2 people who came to visit this garden during Jefferson's lifetime referred to this garden or pavilion as an observatory. So one gets a sense about how this garden was a consciously designed perch to look off into the distance, to look off into what Jefferson referred to as the workhouse of nature. He wrote, "How sublime to look out upon the workhouse of nature, clouds, thunder, lightning, all fabricated at our feet." So this is another kind of American character to this garden, the American panorama of Virginia that's right at the footsteps. This garden was also a revolutionary garden in the sense that one wonders if any man had grown so many different kinds of vegetables before Jefferson assembled this collection of 330 varieties of vegetables during his gardening career at Monticello. And most gardens in Virginia around 1800 were devoid of vegetables in the long, hot summer. Gardeners were relying on traditional European vegetables, which for us are basically cool season vegetables, root crops like beets and carrots, and leafy greens like lettuce and spinach and cabbage family members. What Jefferson did that was really unique was he assembled this collection of hot weather vegetables that were really ideally suited for the microclimate of this garden. Things we take for granted today, but were really new in the early 1800s, from tomatoes to hot and sweet peppers, from eggplants to okra, from butter beans or lima beans to peanuts, from sweet potatoes to cowpeas or field peas. And the real genius of this garden is its microclimate, carved out of the southern eastern side of the mountain, facing to the southeast, capturing this wealth of crop ripening sunshine and enabling Jefferson to really extend the growing season well into the summer months. It was a garden that resembled a climate hundreds of miles to the south. And one of the few advantages one has when gardening on a small mountain the size of Monticello, some 814 feet, was that in the spring and the fall, the cold air tends to settle in low places while the warm air rises up over the elevation of Monticello. And Jefferson, we rarely have a frost at Monticello till well into December. And Jefferson would regularly gloat about the fact that his neighbor's fruit trees were killed by frost in the spring while his own remained unscathed. So this microclimate was really important, not only in enabling him great success with growing these hot weather vegetables, but also extending the growing seasons through the winter months. And Jefferson would regularly sow cabbage family members and leafy greens and root crops in the fall to harvest throughout January, February, and March. This wasn't a fancy garden. Jefferson in his garden book never talks about how he took care of the plants. It's all about setting them out. He didn't have a staff of gardeners, of slaves toiling away in this garden. They were devoted much more to the cash crops on the farm. So it was a very functional garden, a very pragmatic garden. It was always about sowing these new things and seeing what happened to them and then harvesting them for the kitchen at Monticello. And this revolutionary garden in some ways inspired a revolutionary cuisine in the kitchen at Monticello. And we know a lot about food at Monticello from recipes that were left by Jefferson's granddaughters that were probably copied from their mother, Martha, who was Jefferson's daughter. And among these recipes, there were some 17 recipes for tomatoes, for example. Among the recipes was one for what was called okra soup, in effect gumbo. And the lineage of the vegetables in this dish is really interesting to me. There were patty pan squashes, what Jefferson called simlins, and there were butter beans or lima beans. And these were two crops that were grown by Virginia Indians when the first Europeans arrived in the early 1600s. There were tomatoes in this recipe, and tomatoes, of course, were found by the Spanish late in the 15th century, growing in Central America. There were potatoes in this recipe, and potatoes were also found by the Spanish in the Andes. And while the tomato became really popular in Europe and the Mediterranean region, Italy and Spain and Portugal, the potato became really popular in Northern Europe, particularly in the British Isles and cool places. And it was all brought together, the vegetable portion of this dish, by an African plant, okra. And okra had been brought across the Atlantic Ocean in slave ships. And okra cuisine was creolized by the French in the Caribbean. And then slaves brought the seed into southern seaports like Charleston and New Orleans. Then this was all put together in the Monticello kitchen by enslaved African American chefs who'd been trained in the finest arts of French cuisine, both in Paris when Jefferson was serving as minister to France, but also in the White House or the President's house when 3 women slaves were brought from Charlottesville and trained by the French chef in the President's house, a man named Honoré Julien. So what a melting pot of cultures that not only went into the garden from the 4 corners of the globe, but then were processed and put together by enslaved chefs. And what a great amalgam of all these different cultures that were brought together that began to define really who we are as Americans and as Southerners and as Virginians. This eclectic culture made up of all these different parts of the earth. When Jefferson was president, he didn't really live in the White House. He lived in what was called the President's house. It was burned by the British during the War of 1812. But while president, he kept a master plan of presidential meals that he was written in French and was probably copied verbatim from his French chef, this guy named Honoré Julien. And among the hundreds of recipes were ones for what we call today French fries. And there's a lot of folklore about Jefferson being the first to do this and the first to do that, but a really good case can be made that, at least by way of his French chef, Jefferson was the first American to serve French fries in the United States. This is a remarkable document. I hope you can see. It's a chart of 37 different vegetables, and their first and last appearance in the farmers market of Washington, D.C. over the 8 years of Thomas Jefferson's presidency, when they first appeared in the market and when they first disappeared in the market. It's a remarkable document. Here he was president of the United States, but what was he doing? He's keeping this silly chart of when the vegetables came in. And according to one of Jefferson's friends, he went around to foreign embassies, and they would vie with each other to give Jefferson the most unusual type of crop and a vegetable. And Jefferson would get the seeds of these vegetables and pass them around to local farmers with directions on how to grow them. And then he ordered his French maitre d', a man named Etienne Lemaire, who did the shopping. He ordered Lemaire to pay the highest prices for the prettiest cauliflowers or the earliest squashes that were coming into the market. Lemaire, in turn, kept a log in 1806 of all the purchases that were made from this farmer's market. And it's remarkable to see how they bought, he bought parsley 92 different times, and a lettuce on 106 different occasions for presidential meals. But you know, we have this great interest in the farm-to-table movement today, and here's Thomas Jefferson 200 years ago really fostering that movement in the early 1800s. Jefferson's garden at Monticello wasn't the only garden at Monticello. Slaves had their own personal gardens out on the 5,000-acre plantation. And they would cultivate these gardens on Sundays and also in the evenings, and much of the produce they would sell to the Jefferson family in the big house on Sunday mornings. And we know about these gardens from logs that were kept by Jefferson, by his wife Martha, by his daughter Martha, and by his grandchildren. And the chief vegetables were cucumbers, cabbages, and potatoes, kind of typical traditional crops. Between 1804 and 1807, this woman, Anne Carey Randolph, who was Jefferson's granddaughter, her job on Sunday morning was to purchase vegetables from slaves at Monticello. And at this intersection of black and white worlds, one wonders, who was driving the hard bargain. This 14-year-old girl who was made to go out as sort of a rite of passage to buy vegetables, or one of these elderly slaves whose secondary economy was based on getting a good price for 37 cucumbers on a Sunday morning. This wasn't really uncommon in southern plantations. There was sometimes an issue if slaves would start growing cash crops like wheat or tobacco, as to whose crop was it, the masters or the slaves. Now, this is Monticello in the distance. It is indeed a little mountain. But this is one of Jefferson's satellite farms called Tufton, and on a map of his plantation in 1797, he referred to this flat area as Gil Gillette's garden. Gil was one of the slaves at Monticello, a pretty prime piece of real estate at the time. Flat area was unusual at Monticello. As I said, it wasn't unusual, it wasn't unique at Monticello. George Washington's slaves had gardens, and they sold the produce to the big house as well. And money that was made was used to buy food or else to purchase fancy items for one's family. So it was an interesting underground economy that was taking place at the time. The stars of the show in some ways were the vegetables themselves, these 300 varieties of 89 different species of vegetables. The English pea is often regarded as Jefferson's favorite vegetable. He had this heavily choreographed spring planting season of early and mid and late season varieties that were planted at staggered times in February, March, April, and even May. Jefferson had a second home, a place called Poplar Forest that he built when he was retired at Monticello. It's about 60 miles south of Monticello near Lynchburg, Virginia. And Jefferson built Poplar Forest to get away from all the celebrity tourists that were coming to bug him at Monticello. But according to his daughter Martha, Jefferson would often come in the middle of May, and his neighbors near Poplar Forest would go out of their way to have early gardens so that when Jefferson arrived, they could offer him dishes of fresh peas. So it was a vegetable associated with Jefferson. Jefferson also had contests with his neighbors to see who could bring the first English pea to table in the springtime. The winner hosting the losers over for a community supper that included a feast on the winning dish or teaspoon of peas. And the family story is that Jefferson rarely won the contest. He had a neighbor, a man named George Divers, who was an extraordinary, successful gardener. And the story goes that Divers kind of regarded himself as the king of the pea contest every year. And the story goes that Jefferson brought the first pea to table in early May of 1814 before Divers, but refused to tell Divers in fear of rocking the pride of his good friend. Jefferson's granddaughter recalled how Jefferson was the least competitive gardener of any man she'd ever known. And Divers played an important role at Monticello. Jefferson would get these unusual plants from around the world, and he'd always share them with his friends and neighbors and family. And so he'd lose the things, or he'd kill the things at Monticello, but he always could then write to Mr. Divers and say, "Oh, remember that black-eyed pea I brought back from Paris in 1787? Well, I've lost those, or I've killed those. Can you give me some replacements?" So he served as sort of a personal safety net for Jefferson's own efforts at Monticello. We know also a lot about food from this woman. She was Jefferson's second cousin, a woman named Mary Randolph. She ran a boarding house in Richmond, Virginia. And in 1822, she published what's been called the most influential cookbook of the 19th century in America, a book called The Virginia Housewife. And her recipe for peas is kind of like the way we make them now. She would simply boil them with butter and mint and maybe a little onion. Jefferson's granddaughter, who I showed you an image of earlier, had a much more involved recipe that involved first boiling but then sauteing the peas with butter and cream and brown sugar and egg yolks to make sort of a sweet, sugary sauce. It's really pretty good with fresh peas. Lettuce was a big deal at Monticello. Jefferson documented harvesting lettuce every month of the year. One year he sowed with his own hands lettuce 27 different times. When he retired, he published in a national periodical this gardening calendar. It was really kind of a gardening guide. Gardening information was often dispensed by means of a calendar, what you do during the various months of the year. And this is a very modest sort of document, but it was published in a national agricultural journal called the American Farmer, a journal of progressive agriculture. And among Jefferson's pearls of wisdom for this national audience was to sow a thimbleful of lettuce every Monday morning from February 1st to September 1st. So think about that a minute. The first thing you do when you get up for the work week is you go up and sow your thimbleful of lettuce seed, as if that's a life lesson, a discipline that would bring long life and wisdom and all the good things in life. And in fact, Jefferson sowed lettuce 145 times during his retirement years, and like 107 were done on Monday. I don't know if it was Monday morning or not. I can't prove that, but the pattern was there. This was a favorite of his, brown Dutch lettuce that he would sow in the fall for harvesting through the winter months. Another favorite was tennis ball, a Boston-type lettuce that he said he reserved for his second home at Poplar Forest because he said it didn't require as much attention as other sorts. Cabbage was a big deal at Monticello. Jefferson documented some 37 different varieties of cabbage. He had a personal recipe for stuffed cabbage involving carving out the hearts and replacing it with beef and other vegetables. Mary Randolph in her book wrote that cabbage should be as beautiful dressed as it is when growing in the garden. On December 24th of 1821, Jefferson, in his account book, which was a financial log that he kept throughout his life, wrote down that he purchased 59 cabbages from Gil Gillette on December 24th of 1821. And again, at this intersection of black One wonders what Jefferson was doing buying 79 cabbages on Christmas Eve. Were these a source of a great supply of coleslaw, or were they presents for the Monticello community? Were they decorations for the house? Sometimes the more you learn about the past, the more questions that eventually arise. As Jefferson was about to retire from the presidency, he was just yearning to get back to Monticello, and he wrote to his daughter Martha and said, "Oh, I can't wait to come home to my family and my farms and my books, and I can't wait until we can sow our cabbages together." So this rather modest vegetable is used as sort of this image of familial unity in the Jefferson family world. This is a perennial cabbage called sea kale. And sea kale grows wild on the beaches of Great Britain. In the springtime, the shoots come up out of the ground, and the leaves are covered by wind-driven, shifting beach sand. And what that does, it prevents the production of chlorophyll and keeps the leaves white and tender and a little bit more tasty. So when gardeners began growing this plant called sea kale, they used pots 12 to 18 inches high. And in the springtime, when the plants came up out of the ground, they'd cover the plants entirely. They didn't leave the tops open like that. And then when the plants got to be 12 or 16 inches high, they were cut off and, according to Jefferson, prepared like asparagus. And Jefferson's range in the kitchen wasn't as wide as it was in the garden, because whenever he'd get seed of something and he'd send it to someone, he'd always say, "Well, you cook this like you would asparagus." Then later in the season, the sea kale is left to grow up like you do asparagus, so that it produces food for the next year. It's a beautiful plant. It would grow great in Ohio. Those glaucous blue foliages is very ornamental. And Jefferson got 200 plants from a neighbor of his named John Hartwell Cock. And again, friends came to the rescue of Jefferson's garden when Cock sent him 200 plants, and suddenly in Jefferson's garden book there's a record of the dates of the harvest of sea kale every year. Cock was an interesting guy. He lived about 25 miles from Monticello along the James River. Everywhere where Jefferson was kind of flawed as a slaveholder, as a financial manager, as a farmer, John Hartwell Cock was very, very successful. And his house, Bremo, is incredibly beautiful, a beautiful Palladian mansion, still around today. Jefferson spelled tomatoes T-O-M-A-T-A-S. T-O-M-A-T-A-S, like he was pronouncing it tomatoes. He grew the tomato as a culinary vegetable for some 21 years. There's 17 recipes in the Jefferson family manuscripts for everything from gazpacho to tomato ketchup to tomato omelets. You can see a 19th century tomato with that kind of heavily lobed effect. When the tomatoes were, here's one of the first tomatoes that were grown in the early United States. This was a tomato grown by a famous Philadelphia portrait painter named Charles Wilson Peale. And his son did a painting, a still life of this painting of this tomato that Charles Wilson Peale was growing in his garden. And you can see the typical 18th century tomato with those heavy lobes and that kind of patty pan character, what people call an ugly tomato. When tomatoes were first brought to the United States, or excuse me, when they were first found by the Spanish in the 1400s, they were brought into Europe, and they kind of blew the minds of the earliest people who wrote about plants, who were almost medieval in their awe of the sensuality of the tomato. And you think of it, this twining plant with these stinky leaves and this large lap-wetting red fruit. It was almost too sexy for its own good. And so it got a lot of unpleasant associations with other members of the nightshade family. And even as late as the 20th century, English writers would write about the tomato and say, well, that's what they eat down in Portugal and Spain, but no civilized person would eat them. So there's a sort of nativism associated with the tomato, almost a racism that, well, that's what those people eat, but us northern white people, we don't eat those things. So that's an interesting observation, maybe. It may or may not be true. This is a variety we grow at Monticello called purple calabash. It's great on my whole wheat mayonnaise and tomato cheese sandwiches in the summertime. Good tomato. Jefferson's son-in-law was a man named Randolph, Thomas Mann Randolph. He went on to become the governor of Virginia. And in 1822, he gave a speech before local progressive farmers, the Albemarle County Agricultural Society. And his speech was about plant introductions and about how new plants were improving everybody's lives. And he wrote, 10 years ago, he said that no one in Albemarle County was eating tomatoes. But now, he said, 10 years later, everyone was eating them because people believed they quickened the blood in the summertime, whatever that might mean. So it was kind of maybe the medicinal value or perceived value of the tomato that led to its acceptance as sort of the queen of the garden today. The turnip is kind of the queen of the garden of the 18th century. It was important because it was so versatile. It could be eaten almost all year round. It could be stored so effectively. It's very nutritious. And there's numerous recipes in the Jefferson family manuscripts, including one with turnips with cheese. Sounds like kind of Monticello comfort food. Turnips are boiled and just mashed up with a lot of cheese. This is a view from the house of the richest man in Virginia around the time of the American Revolution. His name is Landon Carter. And he lived at a place called Sabin Hall. And he had a series of terraces that led down to the Rappahannock River. And we can't see the Rappahannock because all these trees are growing up. But here's a terrace and here's a terrace. And the topmost terrace was regarded as the most ornate flower garden in Virginia at the time of the American Revolution. And Landon Carter kept a farm diary, and he wrote about going into his garden, his flower garden, and here's a good representation of his flower garden. It was pretty fancy. It had flowers in it rather than grass. He went out into the garden one August, and everything had been burned up by a hot, dry Virginia summer. And he was kind of discouraged. And he also had a case of grout, so he was even more cranky than he usually was. And he said, well, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to plow up my garden. I'm going to plant turnips. So he went and plowed up the garden. He planted turnips. And, well, at least he said, I can use the turnips. I can eat the turnips. So sort of his way of getting back at the world. Two other Jefferson's contemporaries wrote in their diaries about plowing up their yards around the house and planting turnips. And we have, of course, edible landscaping people today who urge us to get rid of our wasteful lawns. And I'm not sure people would choose turnips today. They're sort of low on the hierarchy of people's favorite vegetables. Salsify, or oyster plant, was a favorite in the Jefferson family. One recipe called, in the Jefferson family manuscripts, calling for boiling the roots and then mashing them up and making patties out of them, breading them, and then frying them, she said, like oysters. And it kind of a cross between an artichoke heart and an oyster. They're pretty good. Cucumber was a great favorite of Jefferson's. There was a family story, however, relayed by Jefferson's great-grandson after the Civil War. And he recalled the story that on July 1st of 1826, Jefferson went out into his garden and ate a raw cucumber. And he never felt well after eating that cucumber, and he died 3 days later. So the sort of jocular family story was that Jefferson was killed by a cucumber. And I told you about how Jefferson was fascinated by those Cleveland, Ohio newspapers that were supposed to be 6 and 7 feet long. And he wasn't alone in being an early Virginian fascinated with big cucumbers. Even before Jefferson was born, there was a gardener in Williamsburg named John Custis. And he got a seed of a cucumber he called a turkey cucumber, and he sowed it in his garden. And there was a story about it in the Williamsburg newspaper, the Virginia Gazette, about how people were riding 5 and 10 and 15 miles to see this great curiosity, these cucumbers that were 5 and 6 feet long. And so there was a reader up in Boston who read the Virginia Gazette, and so he wrote a letter to the editor, and he said, yeah, I want to see your 7-foot-long Virginia cucumbers, but wait till you see our 900-pound Boston watermelons we can grow up here. So it set off this mock civil war about who could grow the biggest vegetable. Boys will be boys. And these long cucumbers were probably the Armenian yard-long cucumber, which is really kind of more like a squash than it is a cucumber. Here's a 17th century cucumber, a long way from the smooth, torpedo-shaped fruits we grow today. And this was a favorite of Jefferson called the West Indian gherkin. It's a pickling-type cucumber. And he'd often plant it in the middle of the summertime because it loved the hot, dry Virginia summer. And I mentioned Jefferson's maitre d', who did the shopping in the farmer's market in Washington. And numerous times he documented purchasing barrels of gherkins for the president's house. suggesting that when visitors came to see President Jefferson, on the doorstep to the president's house there was a barrel of pickles for them to help themselves. This garden was restored in the late 1970s. Here's a view from 1975 of Monticello. And the garden is right here. Part of the garden was always there, but a lot of it was truncated by this parking lot. And then this parking lot extended all the way up to right in front of the house. It was a sea of asphalt. And one of the benefits of restoring this garden in the late 1970s was being able to get rid of a lot of these modern intrusions. And one of the techniques that we used was garden archaeology to kind of confirm the Jefferson written document about what this garden was like. And every time you disturb our heavy red clay soil, you leave some sort of lasting imprint in terms of the texture, the color of the soil itself, so that archaeologists, by very carefully troweling off the soil, can see stains in the ground where fence posts had rotted or where fruit trees were planted 200 years ago. And in this slide, this aerial view, in the left center of your screen out here, you can see these little white dots where the archaeologists found stains that corresponded to where Jefferson's fruit trees were, and they form a grid pattern that was identical to a map that Jefferson had drawn of this orchard in 1778. And then along the left side of your screen, you can see a little bit closer spacing, these white dots every 10 feet. And that was the rotted remains of these black locust fence posts that surrounded this entire complex. Jefferson had a 10-foot high fence that ran for nearly 4,000 feet and had boards so close together that, according to Jefferson, not even a young rabbit could get between them. Isaac, who I showed you an image of earlier, described it as monstrous large. And deer weren't a big problem. This was really put up to keep out people and to keep out wild and domestic animals. Most of the deer was harvested. They were so rare that Jefferson had a deer park. They'd actually feed the deer. Here's a view of the excavations of the garden wall and also the foundation for that garden pavilion right here. But much of the wall had been destroyed. The story went that a lot of the rocks had been stolen by the Civilian Conservation Corps in the 1930s when they'd built a modern-day exit road wall. So it was easy, once we found the character of this wall, to just go back and get those rocks and put it back. The pavilion also, we were able to locate it pretty precisely. We had Jefferson's notes and what it looked like. The story goes, it was blown down in a windstorm a year after Jefferson died. And you can see it's perched kind of precariously atop that stone wall. It also was supposedly a favorite place for Jefferson to read in the cool of the evening. But nice ornamental effect at the halfway point of the vegetable garden. So this was restored in the late 70s, early 1980s, and here I was as a young pup. I was involved in the restoration, but also took care of this garden for 35 years. So I had a kind of intimate knowledge of the soil and the soil itself. So I ought to know something. This garden has inspired a lot of really interesting art over the years. Here's an aerial photograph of the garden, and years ago in the 1990s, this woman named Laura Nicholson did this tapestry that's really about 15 feet long of this aerial view of the garden. It hung in the Chicago Institute of Arts for a number of years. She also did this tapestry of the harvest of root crops. Really a wonderful work. Annie Leibovitz might be the most famous photographer in the world today, and she came to Monticello, I think it was 2012, and she was working on a book on pilgrimages to important places, but all she wanted to do was take pictures of vegetables. And so I'd go out in the garden with her and I'd dig up some sweet potatoes and I'd throw them on the ground and she'd take these pictures of the sweet potatoes. I'd do the same with the beets or the lima beans. And I was complaining about how I was working on a book on the vegetable garden, and I had trouble getting a professional photographer to be in the garden at the right time, and the light was perfect, and the plants looked good and everything. And she said, "Oh, you know, you have a great eye. You should be taking your own pictures. Here, take my camera and take your own pictures." So she gave me her camera. It was like having Babe Ruth's bat, having Annie Leibovitz's camera. And it hadn't helped me. It's a simple camera, but I have to get my 21-year-old daughter to help. This is a view she took in, this is actually around December 1st, around the end of November, of the garden with the fall color. And Alice Waters is sort of the mother of the farm-to-table movement today, and she, of course, started Chez Panisse restaurant in Berkeley in the late 1960s, and ever since has been an advocate for fresh produce and organic gardening and community gardening and schoolyard gardening and the way that gardening and food builds community. And she came to Monticello just 3 years ago and made a black tie dinner for some 200 people on the West Lawn. She said it was the most important meal she'd ever made. Here she is washing the lettuce, and one of our gardeners, Eleanor, is looking a little askance at Alice's lettuce watering technique. And Michelle Obama said that perhaps the most important thing she'd ever done in her life was the White House kitchen garden. And when she came to Washington, when was it, 2008? Yeah, 2008. She brought with her the family chef in Chicago, this guy, Sam Cass. And Sam was put in charge of what was called then the White House Food Initiative to encourage children to eat more healthily and to encourage them to get more exercise. And he was also put in charge of that kitchen garden at the White House. And he came to Monticello, and I gave him a tour of the garden, and I tried to inspire him by the Jefferson legacy. So we went back, and he brought a lot of Jefferson's favorite vegetables and reserved a discrete plot in the White House kitchen garden for the legacy of Thomas Jefferson. And here's the use of that quote about the failure of one thing being repaired by the success of another. He was a rookie gardener. So this offered him a certain amount of solace. And Jefferson, in so many ways, was first in food and first in gardening and first in wine. And he's easily called America's first foodie. And every fall at Monticello now we try to use the Jefferson legacy to attract a new audience of people interested in organic gardening and sustainable agriculture. And we have a festival. It's going to be just 2 weeks away, I think, in which we have tomato tastings of 200 tomatoes and probably 250 different educational programs. And we have a big time celebrating this horticultural legacy of Thomas Jefferson. And still at Monticello garden tours, and we have a seed program. You can go to the Monticello website and get seeds from the gardens. And we have a 2-week summer school called the Historic Landscape Institute, studying the theory and practice of historic landscape preservation. So we, again, have successfully used the gardens as a way to tell people more about Thomas Jefferson. And a culmination of a lot of my career there was my 4th book on the gardens, on the vegetable garden. And it's a book published by Yale University Press. Alice Waters wrote the introduction. It's a work of scholarship, but it's also a pretty book. It's it's a coffee table quality book, and it's won a lot of awards. And it was a nice way to finish up my career at Monticello. And I'll be happy to sign books for you all if you're interested in getting one. But do you have any questions?
If you put your hands up, I'll come to you so you can have the microphone. I'll also tell you that there will be a book signing and a reception in the rotunda immediately after this, and please keep your questions brief.
I noted all the tulips that were in front of the house. Can you put them in without refrigerating them?
Yeah.
I came from Virginia, and we always had to put them in the refrigerator.
Well, not in the mountain, not in Charlottesville.
It's cold enough there.
Well, I think that they're refrigerated before we get them, to tell you the truth. I think they're by the bulb companies. We'd often treat them as annuals, and we would harvest them every year and plant them after a growing season. We plant them as cut flowers, but we replace them with fresh tulips every year. They were the most commonly mentioned flower in Jefferson's garden book. And we have kind of a nice tulip display in late April, a nice time to visit Virginia and Monticello during Historic Garden Week.
You mentioned spraying manure like in some of his garden journals and things like that. Could you speak to the soil conditioning, what you did?
Yeah, I'm a great believer in improving the soil with organic matter, and we cover the garden every year with rotted manure or rotted leaves or compost or rotted sawdust. And it's a heavy red clay soil. It's inherently rich. But if you don't treat it right, it'll turn into brick real easily. So it needs conditioning. And that's a great beginning to any gardener, is to improve your soil. And so we spend a lot of energy doing that. It's not the full answer to gardening, but it's a good first step. So we ascribe by that Jefferson philosophy that strong plants growing in good soil bid defiance to problems. I guess you gotta have the mic, I guess.
I imagine that you have not found everything that he grew that was in his journal. Is there any one seed that you would just searched and searched around for, but you couldn't find it, that you just think about?
Yeah, online, you know, I said we have a Monticello website, and we have a journal that we published probably for about 20 years called Twin Leaf. And in the Twin Leaf there's seeds for sale, but there were also scholarly articles. And there was a big long article I wrote on the mystery plants of Thomas Jefferson. And you know, I could name probably 15 of them that I'd love to have that we never were able to find. The Talifer apple, which was the cider apple, was really a famous search that we've made, and people all over the country come up with these Talifer apples. But the problem is we don't know exactly what it looked like. We just have a name and really these vague descriptions. The Monticello aspen tree is another perplexing one. It was a tree of some shade, which aspen trees generally don't have. There was a sprout kale, and we just cannot figure out what kind of sprout kale he was talking about. So yeah, there's one mystery after another. You know, there's things we've sought that we haven't found. His favorite peach was the breast of Venus peach, and we had long adventures bringing that plant from Europe and quarantining it for 10 years and then growing it at Monticello and having it turn out to be the wrong thing. So there were a lot of adventures in searching for the plants of Thomas Jefferson. Many of them were a little frustrating, but there were some good successes.
How did a young man from Detroit end up in Charlottesville?
Yeah, you know, it's a serendipitous story. I was living with my college sweetheart after I graduated from college with a degree in English from the University of North Carolina, and she dumped me for the 4th time. And I considered myself sort of a bohemian poet, but I decided I had to leave and go find a job, and so I wrote to schools all over the country to be an English teacher, and I got one interview at a school outside of Boston to be not only an English teacher but the ice hockey coach. Ice hockey was the sport of my youth. So I got my Volkswagen Bug with my dog Tukum and drove across the country, and I stopped to see my mama in suburban Detroit. And she made me go to her Lebanese hairdresser to shave off my beard and cut my hair. He gave me this really goofy sort of Prince Valiant haircut, and I got to the interview in Boston, and the kindly headmaster sat me down, and the first thing he said, "Well, why are you here?" And I kind of felt stripped of all my identity, and I just babbled for the next 45 minutes about my search for truth and poetry and things. And while I was waiting to hear the fate, I was staying with friends on Cape Cod, and one of them started talking about the joys of shoveling manure and having an organic garden. So I found out I didn't get the job as the ice hockey coach and English teacher, so I decided to go back to North Carolina where I'd gone to college and start an early spring organic vegetable garden. So with no girlfriend and not many prospects and a goofy haircut, I went back to North Carolina, and that's how I became a gardener. It's a 60s story.
Do you have a variety of potatoes? I understand that in the Andes there are a lot of different.
Yeah, you know, there are a lot of potatoes out there, you know, that are called. There's some heirloom tomatoes or potatoes, but most of them don't date back to Jefferson's day. And a potato, you know, he might have called some potatoes early potatoes and some potatoes late potatoes, but he wasn't very specific about the varieties of potatoes he grew. And he also didn't grow them in the garden. He grew them out in the fields and also in the orchards. It was a field crop. And potatoes are pretty interesting, but we always grew a variety called Kennebec, which is real common, but which has been around since the mid-19th century. But potatoes are interesting. They're really kind of slow in becoming accepted. Sweet potatoes were a big deal very early on, in particularly Virginia. But regular potatoes were a little bit slower in becoming popularized in the United States. It's sort of interesting and curious.
Would you repeat the name of that lettuce that had the word brown in it?
Yeah, it's brown Dutch. Yeah, we sell seed of that at Monticello. It's a Monticello exclusive. Also, the tennis ball lettuce is another Jefferson variety of lettuce that is pretty good.
We have one more question, and then I'll remind you he's going to be in the rotunda, and we'll sign books and answer questions.
What's your favorite?
Wait, we got one over here.
Sorry.
Is there a certain way that you would treat tomato blight or mildews and that kind of thing?
Yeah, you know, it's really hard, I think, to fight that. I think it helps if you have, rather than heirloom varieties, if you have hybrid varieties that are more disease resistant. Our blights, we get blight, but it doesn't kill the plants. I mean, it kills the plants, but we still get a lot of tomatoes. But my tomatoes at home are all blighted, and they're still producing a little bit, but the season's coming to an end. So I really don't have a solution to that. Generally, if something gets, you know, there's not much, you could probably spray them with a fungicide and take care of that problem, but I'm not sure it's worth it. So I think the best answer is that you can find some blight-resistant varieties. They're the newest hybrids. They might not be as flavorful as some of the heirloom tomatoes, but they'll probably be more productive.
Okay, so the last question. What is your favorite vegetable you've ever grown or ever seen or could ever imagine?
Yeah, the best vegetable in the world is a field pea, which none of you all ever heard of or know what it is. And a field pea is like a black-eyed pea. You grow them in the hot summer. They're not like the green spring peas I showed pictures of. They're more like a black-eyed pea. But a field pea, you harvest it when it's still green. And they're a wonderful plant because they're a legume. They add nitrogen to the soil. Of hot, humid weather and drought, and they're very productive. And you have to harvest the peas. You can harvest them when they're a little bit dry, but then you peel them and you boil them. You boil the dickens out of them. You boil them for two hours. And Southerners put fat back in the water that they're boiling with them, but I just use olive oil, salt, and pepper. And you boil them down, and they make a gravy. And they're the most delicious thing. And it's just a favorite. My real fantasy of my retirement is to be a field pea farmer. But the idea of shelling all those field peas, I'd have to really find a... And then this year, for the first time, I grew what are called butter peas. And a butter pea is like a cross between a lima bean, which we call a butter bean, and a field pea. They're round like a pea, but they're really a field pea. And I had them for the first time. They were amazing. Have y'all had butter peas before?
Please tell them the story about the rhubarb and Mr. Jefferson.
Yeah, it's in the book. One of the puzzles is that Jefferson grew rhubarb and said it was a esculent leaf like a spinach. And the conventional wisdom is that the leaf of a rhubarb plant is poisonous. So it's kind of a confusing statement, and one wonders if he might have killed his political enemies with rhubarb or poison or made him crazy, or else maybe rhubarb isn't as poisonous as it's reputed to be. Or maybe he was just ignorant. That's probably the reason.
Please take a moment again to thank the Garden Club and Mr. Hatch who made this all possible. That will be available for sale in the rotunda. He's actually selling them and signing them, so be patient with him. And there are also refreshments. So please, everybody, go into the rotunda and I'll have him there within moments. Thank you all for coming.
Thanks to the management and staff of the Hudson Library and Historical Society for their assistance in the production of this program and for providing the adult program series for the citizens of Hudson. For a DVD or Blu-ray copy of this or any HCTV program, contact Hudson Cable Television at 330-653-2500 or via email at hctv@hudson.oh.us.